This is what happened to all those involved in Christ's death, from the judge to the jury to the executioner. One thing I'll tell you right away is that no one who played a role in the crucifixion got away with it. The fate of Pontius Pilate. There is not a Roman governor in all of history more hated than Pontius Pilate, the man who killed Jesus. But what happened to this historical villain after Christ's death? Did he suffer for his sins, or go on like nothing even happened? First off, scholars don't know where Pontius Pilate was born. His origins are about as clear as a toddler's explanation of why there's peanut butter on the ceiling. One tradition says he was a noble from the Pontii tribe in Italy. Another insists he was from Germany, an illegitimate son of King Tiberius of Mayence. Apparently his dad sent him to Rome as a hostage. Ouch, thanks a lot, Dad. Later in life, Pontius landed a very cushy gig as the 6th governor of Judea thanks to his buddy Sejanus, an advisor to Emperor Tiberius. But as governor, Pontius was not a popular fella. He decided to kick off his rule by bringing images of the emperor into Jerusalem and minting coins with pagan symbols. The local Jewish population was not thrilled by this. Historian Flavius Josephus wrote about one of Pilate's more infamous stunts. He brought Caesar's images into Jerusalem at night like a teenager sneaking in past curfew, thinking no one would notice. But they did, and a massive protest erupted. When I say Pontius brought images of Caesar into Jerusalem, these were large stone carvings and colorful paintings of Caesar's face, which were meant to be worshipped. It wasn't unusual for Roman emperors to be worshipped as gods. Pontius threatened to kill everyone who protested. The people, however, were so committed that they laid down and exposed their necks, daring him to cut their heads off. Pilate, realizing that a massacre wasn't the best look for his resume, backed down. The moment that cemented Pilate's place in history was the trial of Jesus. According to Luke chapter 23, verse 8, Pilate had already heard about Jesus and his miracles before he was brought in. Now, you'd think he'd be intrigued and maybe ask Jesus to do a quick water-to-wine trick. Hey, why not? Instead, he tried to pass the decision off to King Herod. Pilate didn't want to be responsible for whatever was about to happen to Jesus Christ. To make things even messier, Pilate's wife, Claudia Procula, sent him a message saying, "Honey, don't get involved. I had a nightmare about this guy. Bad vibes all around." But did Pilate listen? Nope. He ultimately caved to political pressure and sentenced Jesus to be crucified. Wow, great decision-making skills, buddy. After Jesus was buried, Pilate posted a guard at the tomb to prevent any funny business. But Jesus had other plans. A little thing called resurrection made Pilate's security measures look ineffective. Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to heaven, leaving Pilate in a mess of trouble. Remember the guy who got Pilate the job in the first place, his buddy Sejanus? Well, he went and got himself executed, meaning Pilate no longer had a powerful friend in Rome. And when you've already made everyone in Judea hate you, that's not ideal. So how did Pilate's story end? That depends on who you ask. The historian Eusebius tells us that Pilate, disgraced and out of options, committed himself to the grave during the reign of Emperor Caligula. According to legend, his body was tossed into the Tiber River, but the water rejected it and spat out his corpse. Other stories claim he died in France or even Switzerland. There's even a legend that he and his wife became Christians. Either way, his legacy is set in stone. His name is forever tied to one of history's most significant events. The moral of the story is that you ought to listen to your wife's dreams once in a while. Pontius's wife saw the whole fiasco coming. The fate of the high priest Caiaphas. Joseph ben Caiaphas was the high priest who tried to cancel Jesus way before canceling people was even a thing. This was the guy who made one of the worst career moves in history and condemned his soul to eternal damnation. Caiaphas isn't quite as well known as Pontius Pilate, yet his role in Jesus' death was just as important. His name pops up only a few times in the Bible, but wow, did he leave an impact. He was the mastermind behind the trial that led to Pontius Pilate ordering the crucifixion. Caiaphas, high priest of Jerusalem from 18 to 36 AD, was more or less the corporate manager of the Sanhedrin, a Jewish ruling council. There will be more on them later in the video. His main job was to keep things smooth under Roman rule and make sure the people didn't get too rowdy. But then along comes Jesus performing miracles, flipping tables in temples, and most dangerously of all, getting really popular. When Jesus started drawing crowds, healing the sick and raising the dead like a casual necromancer, Caiaphas panicked. What if the people started following Jesus instead of the temple leadership? That was bad news for the Jews. And what if Rome saw Christ's popularity as a rebellion? That was also bad news for the Jews of Jerusalem. To understand Caiaphas, you need to understand the religious power struggle of the time. You had the Pharisees, who were strict, rule-loving, and always ready to point out your spiritual failures. Then there were the Sadducees, the elite class of Jews that controlled the temple. Caiaphas, as a Sadducee, didn't believe in the afterlife, angels, or anything supernatural. When Jesus came along preaching about eternal life, resurrection, and forgiveness, the Sadducees were like, "Nope, we don't do that here." Meanwhile, the Pharisees were upset because Jesus was calling them out for being hypocrites. Jesus annoyed every religious leader, which is a surefire way to get yourself in trouble. After Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Caiaphas saw the writing on the wall. The crowd loved Jesus almost as much as they loved the Beatles. He was performing miracles like Elvis performed with his insatiable hips. People were calling him the Messiah. Something had to be done. Caiaphas orchestrated a trial so shady it would make a modern lawyer cry. It was held at night with a false witness and a pre-decided verdict. When Jesus admitted that he was the Son of God, Caiaphas dramatically tore his robes and declared Jesus guilty of blasphemy. The Jews would have executed Jesus on the spot, except that they weren't allowed to execute anyone without Roman approval. Enter Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who really just wanted to clock out early that day. As we already learned, Pontius was the one who put the last nail in the coffin, but it was Caiaphas who orchestrated the trial. After Jesus' crucifixion, Caiaphas doesn't get much more screen time in the Bible. The book of Acts mentions him one last time when Peter and John get arrested for preaching about Jesus' resurrection. And then that's pretty much it. The historical record says that in 36 AD, Caiaphas was removed from his high priest role, probably because Rome had finally had enough of him. Josephus, the ancient historian, confirms that Caiaphas was out of power and shortly after, out of life. So we can at least say that for all the misery he put Jesus through, Caiaphas was fired, but there is no word on how brutal his death may have been. Do you suppose Jesus would want us sensationalizing the high priest's death, or would Jesus want Caiaphas and Pontius to be forgiven? Now there's a thought experiment. And now for a quick break. But first I wanted to give a shout out and big thank you to Jennifer Ballesteri and Dorothy Breen for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The Fate of Herod Antipas. Grab your popcorn because this royal drama has more twists and turns than a soap opera. It's time for a whirlwind ride through the world of the many Herods in the New Testament. You know how in your homeroom there were like 9 people named Nick or Mike or Dylan? Well, the same kind of thing was going on 2,000 years ago with the name Herod. It was more of a family brand than anything, like the name Kardashian today. There was a whole dynasty of Herods. It's like a Herod family reunion every time you open the Bible. For now, let's focus on the Herod that takes the spotlight most often, Herod Antipas. Antipas inherited the Tetrarchy of Galilee and Perea when his dad, Herod the Great, passed away. You might be wondering what a tetrarch is. It's like getting one slice of pie, and in this case the pie was Herod the Great's vast kingdom. Antipas only got a fourth of the pie, ruling one slice of the province, but he wanted it all. This is important to know because you really get a feel for Antipas's soul and how greedy it was. He divorced his first wife to marry a woman named Herodias, which is creepily close to his name Herod. To make things even creepier, Herodias was his brother's wife. What an awkward family dinner that must have been after the wedding. The only one who was brave enough to speak out against the marriage was John the Baptist. John's fiery preaching earned him a one-way ticket to prison thanks to Herod's orders. Things only got worse from there. Herodias was not a fan of John and she plotted to get rid of him. On Herod Antipas's birthday, Herodias' daughter from an old marriage did a dance that made Herod so happy, again seriously creepy guys, that he promised her anything. So Herodias' daughter asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. Classic move, right? And just like that, John was beheaded, and the gruesome trophy was handed to the girl on a literal silver platter. I think I would have lost my appetite right around then. Fast forward to Jesus' ministry. Herod Antipas heard about a miracle-working guy and freaked out. He thought John the Baptist had risen from the grave. I mean, if you've already beheaded a guy, why wouldn't you assume he's coming back for round 2? When Pontius Pilate got Jesus in his custody, he reached out to Herod for help. Herod was thrilled to meet Jesus, but when Jesus didn't entertain his questions or perform any miracles like a roadside attraction, Herod's excitement turned into frustration. What did Herod do? He let his soldiers mock and beat Jesus, then sent him back to Pilate to be executed. Herod Antipas had every opportunity to spare Jesus from the trial and execution, but he chose not to, and we all know what happened next. So where did Herod end up after Jesus Christ's death? The historical record tells us he fell out of favor with Rome and was exiled to Gaul. He died in Gaul around the year 39, but it's unclear how brutal his last days were. The 3rd century historian Cassius Dio implied that Emperor Caligula had Herod assassinated. If that's true, you can bet your bottom dollar Herod suffered. Caligula was a total maniac. The fate of the great betrayer. How many parents are naming their kids Judas these days? Absolutely zero. In fact, being called a Judas is considered one of the worst insults ever, because Judas didn't just betray Jesus Christ, the Messiah, he betrayed the human race. But why did he do it, and what was his ultimate punishment for it? Judas didn't just wake up one day and decide to betray Jesus. There are a few beats in this story that mainstream media often misses. For example, Judas was handpicked by Jesus himself to be the ultimate betrayer. Jesus knew it was coming. Psalm chapter 41 verse 9 says, "Even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me." Judas was chosen to fulfill the prophecy. Did you know Judas was in charge of Christ's cash? He was basically the apostles' accountant, the treasurer of the group. It's pretty crazy if you think about it, because Judas was a known thief, yet Christ let him handle all their money, knowing full well Judas's greed could not be tempered. The Bible calls him out on it in the Gospel of John. So why did Judas betray Jesus? I have 2 words for you: personal gain. The guy was obsessed with money. 30 pieces of silver was some serious cash, especially 2,000 years ago. Judas was friends with Jesus, but when those shiny silver coins were held up in front of him like a carrot in front of a horse, he couldn't resist. With a smooch in the Garden of Gethsemane, the deal was sealed. Jesus was taken away to be put on trial and executed, and Judas walked away with the spoils. And then things took a dark turn. Have you ever done something that you knew was wrong in the moment, but you did it anyway? Then later it ate at your conscience until you couldn't take it anymore and wanted to turn back the hands of time? If so, you have more in common with Judas than you might think. After betraying Jesus, Judas had a bit of a crisis of conscience, like major regret. He tried to give the money back, saying, "I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood." But the chief priests, including Caiaphas, said, "Too bloody bad, buddy. You did the deed, you live with the regret." Judas was tormented and racked with guilt. He threw the 30 pieces of silver into the temple in a dramatic exit, and then stomped off in total disorder. Later, he was found hanging from a tree. That's how it ended for Judas. Guilty, sad, angry, and dead. Not exactly a fairy tale ending. But wait, there's more. Acts 1 gives us a little too much info on Judas's death. After the hanging incident, the Bible says his body fell from the branch, hit the ground, and exploded in a shower of gore. The moral of the story here is that greed never pays off. Unless, of course, you're a modern billionaire CEO. But for Judas, his greed was his downfall. The chief priests burn in a lake of fire, screaming in agony, thrashing like a drowning person who can't swim, and all the while having your skin boil and blister and melt off the bone. This is the eternal torment supposedly reserved for the chief priests who put Jesus to death. 2,000 years ago, chief priests referred to high-ranking priests who were part of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council that handled legal and religious matters. Caiaphas, the orchestrator of Christ's trial, was the leader of these chief priests. They too were responsible for the crucifixion. The high priest was considered a direct descendant of Aaron, as in Moses' brother, who was there when the 10 Commandments were shoved into the Ark of the Covenant. Chief priests were also influential, although not necessarily seen as Aaron's descendants. They were often part of the priestly aristocracy and served on the Sanhedrin alongside elders and scholars like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Mark chapter 14 verse 53 tells us that Jesus was brought before the high priest and all the chief priests, the elders and the teachers of the law. Acts 23 also brings attention to the role of the chief priests as leaders within the Sanhedrin and in the trial of the Apostle Paul. What I think you'll find eye-opening is that the priesthood was established after the events of Exodus, in which the tribe of Levi was set apart for religious service. Within the Levites, the descendants of Aaron were designated as priests, and Aaron's descendants had a unique role in offering sacrifices and rituals in the temple. Other Levites assisted in various capacities, such as caring for the temple or carrying the ark itself. Basically, these chief priests had been in a position of power for 1,000 years already when Jesus came along. This council was a powerful body of 70 or 71 members, including the high priest who usually served as its president. The Sanhedrin's role was to interpret Jewish law and make decisions on legal matters, including those that arose during Jesus' trial. Alright, so that's 70 members of a powerful governmental body who contributed to Jesus Christ's death. What became of them? Are they currently burning in a sea of eternal fire? The Bible, Acts 4, tells us the Sanhedrin continued to reject Jesus even after he returned to life and ascended to heaven. However, the Bible never explicitly says what became of them. It's rumored some converted to Christianity. Many believe that for their sin, every last high priest is burning in hell. Do you think that's a little extreme or a well-deserved punishment? The fate of the emperor. Can you name the Roman emperor in power during Jesus Christ's ministry? A lot of people mistakenly think it was Nero, but that's not true. It was Tiberius Caesar, one of the most powerful men in Rome. His reign was a never-ending soap opera of political drama, forced marriages, and literal backstabbing. Let's do a bit of a background check on Tiberius before diving into his strange relationship with Jesus. He was born into a family with more baggage than an airport terminal. His dad, Tiberius Nero, was a celebrated general who made the unfortunate mistake of backing the wrong guy in Rome's civil war. The family's fortune was wiped out, and their status was destroyed. But hey, when life gives you political lemons, you get adopted by the emperor. That's exactly what happened when Tiberius's mom, Livia Drusilla, married Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. And just like that, little Tiberius was back in the game. Augustus wasn't just the emperor, he was Rome's CEO, warlord, and part-time deity. He inherited the throne after his uncle Julius Caesar pulled the ultimate plot twist and got assassinated. You know, the Ides of March and all that in 44 BC. Since Augustus only had a daughter named Julia, he needed a male heir. Even though Tiberius wasn't Augustus's biological son, he was still able to succeed him thanks to his mom's marriage power play. Here's another thing a lot of people don't know. Being emperor wasn't all feasts and toga parties. Rome's emperors had an unfortunate habit of getting assassinated. 43 out of 70 emperors were murdered, which is an insane number. It's more than half. That's a worse survival rate than a horror movie protagonist who investigates a noise in the basement. But Augustus and Tiberius managed to keep things relatively stable. Augustus was a master strategist, expanding Rome's power while making himself look like a humble servant of the people. Meanwhile, Tiberius got trained in everything from warfare to politics, kind of like a Roman James Bond, minus the gadgets and with way more sandals. In 14 AD, Augustus kicked, and Tiberius, now in his 50s, reluctantly took the throne. And while Tiberius busied himself keeping Rome in check, something big was happening far away in Judea. A man named Jesus was preaching about love, forgiveness, and a kingdom greater than Rome. To be honest, Jesus wasn't even a blip on the imperial radar. Pontius Pilate did have him killed under the authority of Tiberius, but Tiberius didn't know what was really happening in Judea, not until after the crucifixion. Afterward, Christ's followers spread like wildfire. According to later historians Eusebius and Tertullian, when reports about Jesus' popularity reached Tiberius, he was intrigued. He even proposed to make Jesus part of the Roman pantheon. Yeah, there's something new to tell your friends. Emperor Tiberius would have put Jesus on Mount Olympus with the other gods, but the Senate, always a tough crowd, shut the idea down. Tiberius' son died shortly after Christ's resurrection, and Tiberius was never the same. He ended up being exiled and spending his last years as a weird hermit. He named his nephew Caligula as his successor, then came down with a frightening sickness. But instead of letting him heal, Tiberius's Praetorian guards decided they were over it and finished him off by smothering him with a blanket. Talk about a tough way to go. Just like that, the man who ruled one of the most powerful empires in history became a footnote in the story of a carpenter from Nazareth whose influence would far outlast Rome itself. King Herod, the Christmas villain. You know a guy's bad news when he's the actual villain of the original Christmas story. King Herod the Great was the guy who heard that a baby had been born with the title King of the Jews and thought it was a good idea to kill all of the babies in Bethlehem. There's only one problem with this Christmas massacre. There's no record of it outside the Bible. Herod's babe murdering rampage is not mentioned anywhere outside of Matthew's Gospel. No other biblical books, no Roman records, not even an angry Yelp review from 1st century Judea. So was Herod really that bad, or did Matthew just need a villain who made Darth Vader look like a babysitter? Okay everybody, it's history time. Herod the Great ruled Judea from about 37 to 4 BC, meaning he was technically the king when Jesus was born. Historians like Josephus have given us the receipts on Herod's life, and archaeologists have even dug up his old stomping grounds, including what's probably his tomb. Herod was a real and vicious king put in charge by the Romans. He, like Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate, was charged with keeping his Jewish subjects happy and making sure they didn't revolt. It was like trying to host a dinner party where half the guests are vegan, the other half are hardcore meat lovers, and you're expected to make everyone happy. It didn't always go as planned. Some might say Herod the Horrible was a more suitable name than Herod the Great. Herod had trust issues, and by that I mean he was so paranoid that he had his own wife and 3 of his sons executed because he thought they might betray him. Imagine being at his family dinner table. Herod's like, "Pass the bread, son." His son passes the bread and Herod screams, "Treason! Guards!" The dude was basically an ancient Game of Thrones character. But what about that whole baby massacre thing? If the Bible is to be believed, Herod ordered the execution of all male children under the age of 2 within the vicinity of Bethlehem. Whether it truly happened or not, Herod still suffered greatly for his miserable life. You can't just plot to assassinate baby Jesus and get away with it. His last years were a hot mess of health problems, family betrayals, and general misery. Some sources say he had a disease so painful that he literally tried to stab himself, which is kind of poetic justice for a guy who stabbed so many others. The disease became known as Herod's Evil after he died, but scientists still don't know what it was. After his death came the other Herod from today's video, Herod Antipas. You can bet that Antipas was a chip off the old block, a real villain like his dad. He would later pick up where his father left off in murdering the Messiah. Which Herod do you think was the worst? Let me know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. The martyrdom of Longinus. You've probably heard of the Roman centurion who stood at the foot of the cross when Jesus was crucified. The guy who, after witnessing the sky darken, the earth shake, and all the holy chaos unfold, famously declared, "Truly this was the Son of God." That centurion's name was Longinus, and his story doesn't end with the death of Christ. It ends somewhere far, far worse. Longinus wasn't just any soldier. He was the centurion in charge of the squad that oversaw crucifixions under the governor Pontius Pilate. When Jesus was executed, Longinus had a front row seat to the most important event in human history. At least the most important event according to Christians. Church tradition says that Longinus pierced Jesus' side with a spear. He did it to check if Christ was dead, kind of like poking roadkill with a stick. Out of the wound poured blood and water. Some of it splashed into Longinus' eyes. Longinus happened to be suffering from an eye disease and could barely see. But when Jesus' blood touched his pupils, his eyes were miraculously healed. After the crucifixion, Longinus had a change of heart. He's been called the first convert in all of Christianity. Longinus is said to have left the army afterward, got baptized by the apostles, and started spreading the news that Jesus was alive. Longinus went from spear-poking Roman centurion who killed Jesus to a minister spreading Jesus' teachings. He went to his hometown of Cappadocia, where the local Jewish leaders really didn't like him and his preaching. Christian law tells us that Jewish leaders pressured Pontius Pilate, who was probably so tired of dealing with Jesus-related drama by this point, to handle the situation. Pilate sent a kill squad to take out Longinus. In the end, Longinus lost his head to assassins for preaching the word of Christ. After Longinus was executed, his head was sent to Pilate, who apparently, still salty about the whole situation, had it thrown into a trash heap outside the city. Today, Saint Longinus is venerated as a martyr who went from Roman soldier to eyewitness of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. His feast day is celebrated on October 16th every year. He's one of the most important saints in Christianity. The fate of the cross-bearer. Did you know Christ was not the only man to bear his cross? He had a helper, a guy who would meet one of the worst possible ends you can imagine. Simon of Cyrene helped carry the cross on Jesus' journey to Golgotha. According to 3 out of the 4 Gospels in which Simon is mentioned, he was a man of Cyrene, which was a city in what's now Libya, North Africa. It happened to have a large Jewish population, suggesting Simon had traveled to Jerusalem for Passover. The Gospel of Mark tells us that Simon was a passerby during Christ's long walk to his place of death. Simon, upon seeing Christ, was forced to help him carry the cross while all others looked on. The fact that Jesus even needed help carrying the cross shows just how much he had already suffered. By the time he reached this point, he had been beaten, scourged, and was barely able to walk. If you've seen The Passion of the Christ, hopefully you're not getting some PTSD flashbacks right now. That movie was brutal. Simon stepping in to help Christ underscores the extent of Jesus' sacrifice and how much his human body endured. Even though he was God, he allowed himself to experience the full weight of human pain, exhaustion, and suffering. It's important to know Simon didn't volunteer. He was forced by the Romans to help carry Christ's burden because Jesus physically couldn't keep going. Nonetheless, the experience profoundly changed Simon, who had just been going about his life normally up to that point. The Bible doesn't say explicitly what happened to Simon after, but many traditions suggest he became a believer and even preached the gospel. Simon may have been one of the first to spread the gospel to the Gentiles. His reward for becoming a Christian? Tradition tells us Simon was martyred in 100 AD, sawn in half. Someone sawed him clean in two like a magician's botched trick. Only there's no indication of whether he was cut in half lengthwise or through the midsection. Which sounds worse to you? The eternal fate of the thieves. Jesus was not crucified alone. 2 others shared his fate, but they did not go to the same eternal reward. One was condemned, and the other was saved. The 2 men crucified alongside Jesus are often referred to by the names Dismas and Justus, yet these names do not appear in the Bible. Instead, they come from later apocryphal writings, texts banished from the Bible and locked away in the Vatican's secret archives. One of the books that goes into detail about Jesus' crucifixion neighbors is the Gospel of Nicodemus, which was written around the 4th century AD, long after the events of the crucifixion. All 4 Gospels mention that Jesus was crucified between 2 criminals, but only Luke gives us additional details about their interaction with Jesus. Luke says the first thief, known as Justus, mocked Jesus cruelly, while the other, Dismas, rebuked the first thief, acknowledged Jesus' innocence, and humbly asked to be remembered in his kingdom. Jesus promised the repentant thief that he would be with him in paradise that very day. The other thief was not given the option. You can't just behave badly to Jesus and expect Santa to bring you new toys. Saint Dismas is recognized today as the first person to enter heaven after Jesus' sacrifice. His feast day is celebrated on March 25th, the traditional date of the crucifixion. That's great for Dismas, but what about Justus, the unrepentant thief? What happens when you die alongside Jesus but refuse to believe and actively mock the Messiah? I'll tell you what happens. You go to hell. It's sad, but it's what the Bible tells us. In the case of Justus, Christian law says that at the moment of Christ's passing, he writhed in agony. His feet jerked and he died. As he did, the cross he was hung on twisted and hung slanted, a symbol of evil. Dismas ascended to paradise, and the mocking thief went straight down into the undying flames of eternal damnation. Sorry man, raw deal. Whose fate do you think was most deserved, and who got the worst deal of all? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching. Remember to hit subscribe and come back soon for more awesome stuff from the channel.